Dirty Moderates, as you know, we have covered Israel extensively here, especially since the bloody pogrom of October 7th and the massacre, largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. Everybody who listens knows that this is a Zionist safe space. You know how we feel about the rise of anti-Zionism, which is simply anti-Semitism. You know how we feel about how the left has turned against Jews in Israel and America. That does not excuse the right. But you also know that we like to do a deep dive, as we've done for you, on the nuances of the Middle East, Israel, its relationships with the larger region, and the future of its safety and security. And so I am so pleased to welcome somebody that I've been following on Twitter for a while, and we finally got him. It's the big get. Shaiel Ben-Ephraim is joining me today. We're both actually based in LA, but not in the same room. Just by way of introduction, Shaiel is a former UCLA professor. He's and a diplomat. He has a PhD in military strategy from the University of Calgary. He hosts an amazing podcast that, if you're not listening to, you better. History of the Land of Israel podcast, it's called. And he also has a YouTube channel, Israel Explained, which is also important and essential watching. He has a book out, Israeli Settlements and Regional Factors in Relations with the U.S. Can we settle this? Stuff to talk about. I've got so much to talk to him about. Shaiel, welcome to Dirty Moderate.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
So let's just start with this. Okay. Give the listeners, because I think it's just essential for your background, not just your academic background, but your personal background. Because your tweets are and your podcast and your show really, I think, make one of the more I don't want to even just say credible, but intellectually robust cases for the safety of Israel, for its endurance, for Zionism. Tell us who you are and how you got to be doing this before we dive into the multitude of issues which we could be here forever talking about.
Yeah, so I think I have a good place to try to make Israel, its history, and its issues accessible to the American Jewish community. I think that's my advantage because I was born in Israel, grew up in Israel, went to the army, all that stuff in Israel, but my parents are American. That's why I don't have the accent, although I can fake it if you want. My mother's from Queens, my father's from Brooklyn. I'm a Mets fan, you know, so like I have a lot of American in me. I haven't actually lived in the US for that long, since 2017, but you know, I have a lot of American in me. I went to I was in IDF intelligence, went to Hebrew University, got my first 2 degrees there, worked for the Israeli Foreign Ministry, worked as an analyst as well for NATO, was a professor in Israel studies. Now I'm working in high tech, but being out of academia has allowed me to make my research on Israel more accessible. So that's who I am, and that's what I do.
That's great. Now, you know, given that, if obviously not everybody's on Twitter, but you know, following you is great because you have a way of making those 240 characters, and sometimes we use more. I do too. You know, a platform to educate. You know, but what I like about what you do, and sometimes I admittedly will get more passionate and throw a little too much spaghetti at the wall in my anger and anti-Semitism. But I like that you streamline the pro-Israel case, and you never sound, you know, like you're dogmatically, you know, Netanyahu's chief lackey or something. And you're certainly not naive, and you bring that, I guess that is American-Israeli special relationship really to the fore. Let's start then with just the current events. Okay, we have Rafah, and we have the sort of next phase of Israel in Gaza, and we saw this miraculous rescue of 2 hostages, Argentinian hostages, Sunday night, or it might have been Sunday, whatever time of day it was. And you saw, you know, just leading up to that, the Biden administration warning Netanyahu not to go into Rafah, obviously more from a humanitarian and military reason, but and lots of all the armchair experts, all the Jew haters and anti-Zionists on there, how dare they, Israel should cease fire, keep 130 plus hostages in captivity. Why should we be doing this, et cetera, et cetera. Talk to us about where we are right now. We're 4 months after October 7th. I don't think it's any less intense. Netanyahu has no signs of wanting to stop this, absent a kind of full return of the hostages or ceasefire or anything like that. So kind of take the temperature for the audience about this current moment in Israel.
Okay. Yeah, we're in a moment of real transition.
Okay.
There has been a decision made, at least formally, by the Israeli government to go into Rafah.
Okay.
But there's an element there of, trying to use that threat to get diplomatic and political gains. I don't think Israel is sure that this is actually going to happen. So their official position is that they're doing it, but what they're trying to do, if they can, is get concessions on the hostages, get concessions from the United States, get concessions from Egypt, and indirectly from Hamas in return for not doing it. And that works out well because preparing this operation will take a while because there are, I've heard different numbers, but well over 1 million internal Palestinian refugees in Rafah. And going in there when they're all in there would be insane. And of course, inhumane. So Israel has to come up with a plan in order to clear them out of there. Also, Egypt and the United States are leaving no choice. That will take a little bit of time. Israel can start those preparations without actually launching the strike and then hope to get concessions. The reason it's not wanting particularly to go in is because Israel knows it will pay a significant price in relations with Egypt and the United States for doing so. Having said that, there is no agreement that Israel can sign on to. Israel will go in and will defeat Hamas in Rafah. There's full support for that in Israel among everyone pretty much from right to left, except for the extreme left. Yeah, so that's where Israel is. And militarily, Israel right now is winning the war quite handily, although tactically, not strategically, because strategically you have to have a real goal to end it, and Israel does not have that. And it needs the support of the United States, Egypt, and other countries to do that, which is another reason it doesn't want to sour relations with them.
Right. One of the things that we're going to get into this sort of place route with Israel and the Biden administration, but one of the things that Joe Biden said early on is that one of the reasons Hamas launched this attack, he didn't say it was the only reason, was because they wanted to derail any potential Israel-Saudi relationship that had been in the works. For obvious reasons. Your tweet today, I want to talk about, which is great. So I want to dive into that and then the overall relationship with the Biden administration and Israel. So you tweeted, the Saudis are putting together their own normalization plan with Israel in tandem with the U.S. and the UAE. It has 3 phases. Number 1, a complete ceasefire and hostage exchange. Well, of course, better. Number 2, a national unity plan for the Palestinians and rebuilding the Gaza Strip. If only that were to happen. Number 3, a Palestinian state. I have my doubts. Number 4, Israeli-Saudi normalization. Talk to us about this. Is this like a revivifying, if you will, of this potential talk that was somewhat put on hold during this war, or what's really going on here that's creating a new atmosphere for this possibility now?
Yeah. So we don't know how much the whole Saudi thing linked into the decision to launch October 7th. It might have had something to do with the timing, definitely not with the idea. They came up with the idea for 2 years ago at least, but the timing maybe. We don't really know. But yeah, as far as what's happening now, the Biden administration a few months ago revived the idea of Saudi normalization for 2 major reasons. One is in order to entice Israel into ending the war. That gives sort of a nice prize for Israel for doing that. And the other, just as important, is a major geopolitical achievement before the elections.
Right.
They managed to convince the Saudis to get on board nominally, although what they haven't been successful with is getting the Saudis to waive conditions that make this unrealistic, at least from the Israeli perspective. Not only are they talking about a Palestinian state, but not just a passing recognition that a Palestinian state should happen in the future, which is difficult enough to achieve with this government, but also that Palestinian state would be on the 1967 borders, which is impossible to achieve with any Israeli government, no matter who's leading it. It's just not realistic. It doesn't matter whether you think that it's a good idea or not. Right. So it's been revived in the sense that the Saudis are willing to talk about it, but it hasn't been revived in the sense that it doesn't look to me like it's a serious initiative, because Israel will never agree to the terms. It's at this point, it almost seems to me like everyone's going through the motions to seem like they're trying to solve things rather than it could be solved. These are non-starters as long as Netanyahu is in there. And like I said, 67 borders, non-starter no matter who's in there.
Right. I want to see in this number 2 here, a national unity plan for the Palestinians in rebuilding the Gaza Strip. Whose national unity plan? The Saudis? Who? Can you break that down?
Yeah, so there's something here that isn't being talked about a lot in the Western media that's very important.
Okay.
Israel is talking about the elimination of Hamas as any kind of governing force whatsoever.
Right.
The Palestinians are not talking that way. The Palestinian Authority is using this opportunity to integrate Hamas into the government. That's what they're trying to do as junior partners. Which
you mean to the PA? To
yes.
them? Okay.
Yes. So Abu Mazen has gone to that's Mohammed Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority. He went to Doha, to Qatar, to meet with the Hamas delegation to discuss these terms. Right. The entire Arab world is behind this initiative, which again is not being discussed for some reason. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, everyone agrees. Egypt, everyone agrees that this is a good idea. Again, Israel does not. Israel doesn't want to see Hamas be a junior partner of any kind for obvious reasons. What Israel wants is for Hamas to be completely taken out of the government. This is another element that's a non-starter from the Israeli perspective. It's also technically a non-starter from the American perspective. Their official position is that Hamas should not be part of a Palestinian government. Obviously, they're not going to go fight tooth and nail over it the way Israel does, but officially, they're on the same side as Israel on this issue.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there is this cognitive dissonance that goes on, I mean, less in the United States, but certainly globally, with many a country in the West designating Hamas as a terrorist organization, and then being, every time Israel defends itself, getting into sort of finding this kind of queasy slouch of, yeah, well, you can't do that. There's too much death and destruction, and you're killing too many people, or there's too many innocents are going to die, you know, figure out another way, as if they're military strategists somehow, you know, by sitting there and just guessing or pontificating, which I find very worrisome. I mean, all of this is to say is that, you know, it has to be a non-starter from Israel. It has to be a non-starter from America. I mean, Israel wouldn't be going to this extreme had October 7th not happened. It certainly opened up an opportunity for Netanyahu to be hawkish. But, you know, this was long in the making, you know, and living alongside an entity that is dedicated to your destruction, you know, was, which it's untenable for Israel, which is why Israel, as you mentioned at the beginning of the program, except for the extreme left, supports the continuing incursion and invasion and military operation. But as I just wrote on my Substack, and you'll know it all too well, you know, the PA, Fatah, what was the PLO, Arafat, I mean, they were intent on never having peace and destroying Israel. Do you know what I mean? This does not minimize Hamas's menace or evil, but in what time of Israel's existence has it not had to assume a posture of self-defense? I mean, I find that there's a larger philosophical question, you know, but sometimes the Arab world finds a way of uniting for reasons that I think, you know, not always are anti-Israel. I mean, the larger Arab world. But they want Israel to accept things that they simply can't accept. It makes Israel very unique to have to live the way it does. It's had to live that way for 75 plus years. You know, I mean, how is there really a long-term end game where Hamas exists and Israel doesn't continue its military action? I guess is what I'm asking. I know there was a long-winded way of asking it, but.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll comment a little bit on the exposition that you made. I agree with you that generally speaking, Israel has been the victim of attacks and has had to have self-defense. I do think that we've fallen into a trap as Israelis, as pro-Israeli supporters, etc., of blaming the entire conflict on the other side which removes not only responsibility from us, but I'd say it removes the importance of our decisions, our agency almost. You mentioned Arafat in the 1990s. There was a moment in the 1990s where, according to all historians and experts, the PLO was trying to reach some sort of agreement.
Yeah.
Israel made a terrible mistake by continuing to expand settlements. And that made Arafat and a lot of other Palestinians think that the process, without added violence, wasn't going to reach the end goal. They tried to pair the process with violence in a terrible way. They shouldn't have done it. It was totally immoral. And that led to where we are today. But my point is that today we're at a juncture, again, where Israel has to make decisions. And if we just say to ourselves, you know, nothing that we do matters because the Arabs all want to kill us, then our decisions don't matter. We can decide anything. And that's not true. Our decisions matter. Whether there's peace or not has a lot to do with what we do. It's 2 to tango, not 1 to tango. Obviously, the Palestinians have had a major role in there not being peace, but we have a role in what happens too. So I just want to say that. As far as a future with Hamas, without Hamas, Israel needs to continue the war as long as Hamas is running Gaza. I mentioned Oslo a second ago. Hamas had a major part in destroying Oslo too. They were bombing in 95, 96 when I was a teenager.
Well, and so did the radical extremists who shot Rabin, that crowd.
Yes, of course, exactly. So Hamas has been trying to torpedo peace forever.
Yeah.
Since they've existed, since the 90s. And we need to eradicate their influence in order for there to be peace. It's not mutually exclusive. We have a bit of an issue among people on our side that we seem to have people who either want to use the military force or want to have negotiations and act like those two things are separate, when you need to destroy the enemies of peace and try to talk to the people who you can talk to at the same time. One thing I always say is we need to be bold on the military plane, but also on the diplomatic plane. We need to be able to take risks on both. We need to take the initiative on both. So what Israel needs to be doing right now is eliminating Hamas on the battlefield, but also making diplomatic initiatives, not waiting for other people to make initiatives, making our own initiatives that shut Hamas out of the process. Kill Hamas on the battlefield, kill Hamas politically. Once Israel has all of Gaza, and this is another reason I think Israel should take all of Rafah. Once Israel has all of Gaza, it has leverage to make demands. No Hamas, no UNRWA, all those sorts of things, a reformed PA. All the things that Israel wants, it will have the leverage to do, but it needs to use military force and leverage in order to get diplomatic gains. So that's what Israel is not doing, and that's why I say Israel's winning tactically, but not strategically.
Not strategically. Let's talk about Netanyahu. Okay. Yeah. I mean, obviously, we saw a vast majority of Israelis last year, or before October 7th, rise up against what looked like a judicial power grab or consolidation of the government at the expense of an independent judiciary, however you want to look at it, sort of finding Israel doesn't have a written constitution, so making the executive have a kind of unlimited unitary power. Seemed like a mass uprising across ideological lines in Israel, right, against the overreach of Netanyahu's government, et cetera, et cetera. You say the majority of Israel is behind this military operation. Would you say that in terms of this, since October 7th, those attempts to unify sort of previously disparate parts of the Israeli people into a kind of unified whole for this response, or not necessarily? Take us inside Israel.
The one word answer to your question is no. It has not healed the rift in Israel. It has temporarily put some damper on the fire. And even that is starting to fade. When we saw a few days ago, we saw demonstrations for continuing the war near where humanitarian aid is going into Gaza. And at the same time, we saw demonstrations against the government in Tel Aviv. And I think that was a moment where this kind of, not to use the term in the wrong area of life, but ceasefire between the two factions was really over. And one thing that we've seen recently is vicious attacks on the families of the hostages who are trying to get them released, calling them traitors. And some people are saying on social media and to their face, I hope all your relatives die in there.
Because they're opposing the continuation of the military operation.
Yes, yes. And that is the first month or so, there was a lot of unity and a lot of talk, and there still is a lot of talk about we should be united. But it's a little bit like in the United States. Lots of people are saying we should be united, but that doesn't heal anything. What's really changed from the war, but a lot of it just from the judicial reform era, which you talked about, is the balance between the camps. The anti-Netanyahu camp is much bigger now. It's far bigger than it was before, because the way that he dropped the ball on October 7th, and to a lesser extent, the sense that he hasn't handled the war as well as he could have, that might get worse if he doesn't end the war properly. Netanyahu is even more unpopular. So there is a schism. There is a rift. It's not gone anywhere. And Netanyahu's in the minority. His supporters are in the clear minority, according to every poll.
According to every poll. I mean, it's interesting, right? Netanyahu's whole comportment, his whole ideology, his whole existence, right, has been, I think, sort of twofold. One was the personal, avenging Yonatan's death, and then Tebi, something I don't think he ever got over. But the larger idea that there would never be peace with Arabs. He came from the generation that would never happen and couldn't happen. And it's been sort of part of his Weltanschauung, his worldview, if you will, of the whole region. How would you, if you could be as impartial as possible, I know that's kind of impossible, but objectively speaking, to the extent Shaiel Ben-Ephraim can be, how would you evaluate Netanyahu's time as Israel's leader overall?
Well, Netanyahu is a little bit of a Greek tragedy. I've worked for him. He is a man of unbelievable abilities that are probably unparalleled by any other leader in the world. I really can't think of an equivalent to Netanyahu's abilities, whether we're talking about the economic way that he brought Israel out of a recession, almost a collapse in the early 2000s, the way he predicted that the disengagement was a terrible idea, his amazing diplomatic achievements late in his career. So he's had some great successes, and we have to also, if we're going to put blame on Netanyahu for certain things, remember that he played a major role in Israel becoming the high-tech superpower, one of the richest countries per capita in the world. Israel is catching up with Germany right now in per capita GDP, which is unbelievable. And that happened under Netanyahu. Generally speaking, up until October 7th, Israel experienced less terrorism under Netanyahu than under other prime ministers. And despite the fact that all these people have been warning that Israel is going to experience diplomatic isolation, under Netanyahu, Israel managed to extend its web of relationships to countries that people did not expect, like India, like Greece, and of course the Abraham Accords. So these are all great triumphs. Unfortunately, at this point, it's pretty clear that the negative outweighs the positive. That really started, and I voted for Netanyahu before. Like I said, worked for him, voted for him. Always had my suspicions.
Like most people continue to, for some reason. I mean, they have voted for him.
Yeah, I haven't voted for him in a while, but I used to. And what's changed is when he started to get involved in corruption. He was not a corrupt prime minister early on, or at least not notably corrupt. At some point, being in power for too long caught up to him. And then what happened is once he started getting involved in court cases and so on, the national interest became less compelling to him, and his personal interest became more compelling to him. That's one of the reasons we saw the judicial reform. The judicial reform, that's something that Netanyahu said for years.
Right.
that he would never do, that he respected the judges in Jerusalem because he's a brilliant man. He understood that Israel's judicial independence is the bedrock of its democracy. It also protects Israel from international courts and is therefore a boon to the national interest on every level. It also protects Israel's liberal democracy from theocratic forces. And Israel's liberal democracy is the engine of the economic growth that I just talked about. He knows all that, but his personal problems overshadowed that. Then there's another problem that may be even bigger than the personal interest. This is his genuine conception of the national interest, which was faulty. He believed that Israel could ignore the Palestinian problem, leapfrog it, and make peace with the Arab states. And when the Abrahamic Accords were signed, he seemed vindicated. The trouble was, how did he do that? His strategy was a divide and conquer for the Palestinians, which sounds clever on the face of it. Israel will ignore the PA, allow it to survive, give it just enough money to survive. Meanwhile, make sure that Hamas has enough money to survive through Qatar. And that way, there will be no united Palestinians, and you won't have to negotiate with anyone. And the idea was that Hamas was a diplomatic and strategic asset by stopping Israel from having to make concessions and talk and allowing it to focus on the other Arab states. That exploded in his face. That wasn't about his political corruption cases. That was an epic misjudgment on his part. Those two things are so significant, we don't know how this ends yet, that they will tarnish his entire legacy.
Oh yeah, no, well said. And I want to get into the Abraham Accords, to Trump, to domestic American politics. But before we do, let's go to the Palestinian state question, which is very important. So to your point about the Oslo Accords, I lived through all this. I'm 49, so I remember Bill Clinton, and they were on the White House lawn, which of course had started before him, but Arafat and Rabin came to the White House lawn and quote unquote gave peace a chance. And then of course there was the assassination of Rabin and Hamas and all that stuff, leading to what many thought was the most viable deal ever offered, Bill Clinton and Ehud Barak, where everybody screams about, I think, many bad faith actors, but there are some good faith actors in there that said if only, the Palestinians had a state with 92% of the West Bank and all of Gaza and all of that stuff, we would be in a much better place. Maybe the capital would be East Jerusalem. I know the right of return has always been a big issue, obviously, since 48. And Bill Clinton famously said Arafat's a liar. They got down to the wire and Arafat pulled it. Of course, then the second intifada happened and it's all been to hell since then. Of course, Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005, but all that stuff. So time and time again, there have been many attempts at a Palestinian state. To your point about the larger Arab world, and we'll dovetail with that question in a second. Israel has had a long-lasting peace with Egypt and Jordan. Egypt, of course, was its greatest adversary for the longest time. It's had peace with Jordan since the 90s, Egypt since the Camp David Accords. How do we, I don't know if it's a Mahmoud Abbas or a PA question now, how do we get to any semblance of a Palestinian state that would not just be in existence, but would be self-governing, prosperous, and free of a dedication or absent a dedication of the destruction of Israel? I know it's all harder question, but everyone's always talking about it, but it's like, when this stuff happens and I see the way people turn against the Jews so quickly and against Israel, there is a part of me that has always wanted a two-state solution. There's a part of me that says, yes, it's not tenable for Israel not to have one, but is it tenable for Israel to have one? I don't know.
Yeah. My answer is yes.
Okay.
But it's very, very difficult road to get there. There's a few obvious things that need to happen before we can talk about a Palestinian state.
Right.
One of them, of course, is getting rid of Hamas. That's first. But then there's also structural elements with the Palestinian Authority. Everyone talks about how they sponsor the families of martyr terrorists, what some people call pay to slay. And that, of course, needs to stop because that creates an incentive to terrorism. Just as important, maybe more importantly, is the education system. The education system in the Palestinian Authority needs to be changed from top to bottom. It needs to be put under international supervision. It needs to be anti-Semitic, pro-terrorist materials need to be removed. The Palestinian Authority, or whatever government replaces it, that's also a possibility, needs to be, you can't eliminate corruption, needs to be made less corrupt. This is something, by the way, that Abbas is taking very seriously. He actually had a plan, has a plan, he's discussing in Doha, of putting the Palestinian Authority under World Bank supervision, which I think would be fabulous. So what Israel needs to do, as I hinted at before, is use the fact that it takes over Gaza, which is one reason it needs to take over Gaza completely, right? And use that as leverage for reforms on the PA, or to demand a new government that's better. Whatever works. I'm not married to the PA. The only advantage the PA has, from my perspective, is that it's internationally recognized. It has no other real advantages I can think of. So if it's not the PA, it's not the PA. I really don't care. But a Palestinian government that is not Hamas, that Israel can work with and have those reforms. And also removing UNRWA and the permanent refugee status. And I know a lot of people are listening to this conversation and thinking this won't be enough, but those steps would change a lot. And Israel has the leverage to make those changes if it insists on them and initiates them. And that would be a great start. And of course, Israel's demanded, and the United States fully agrees with this, that state needs to be demilitarized. The mechanism for demilitarization is something that we can discuss. But all these steps, and in my opinion, Israel needs to do something serious about the settlements. Honestly, I would evacuate them all at the right moment, not now as a reward for October 7th, but at the right moment. But Israel needs to do something about the settlements in order to show that it has goodwill, because the Palestinians believe, and they're correct, that Israel has used negotiations for years as cover to expand its settlement project. That's our sin. That's what Israel did that is completely wrong and inexcusable. And the more of us face that and say that, the better.
Right. That was actually my next question. So Israel basically would have to stop occupying the West Bank, pretty much. Yes?
Sounds like a good idea to me. Of course, gradually. Aside from the fact that there are settlements there, Israel has genuine security concerns that currently can only be met by the IDF being in the West Bank. We see that there's massive Hamas infrastructure, Islamic Jihad infrastructure, Lion's Den, all sorts of new organizations that have popped up there that are an incredible menace. And Israel releasing a bunch of prisoners to the West Bank, possibly thousands in an agreement. We don't know how many, but the worst ones will certainly be released, is not going to help matters. And of course, you can shoot missiles and rockets at Ben Gurion Airport from the West Bank. That would that would stop the entire Israeli economy. The weak spot of the Israeli economy, which everyone knows, is that airport. That airport shuts down, So right now, Israel needs a presence there militarily. It never needed a presence of people there. It never needed that, in my opinion. It does need a military presence. Removing that will require a form of de-escalation, international guarantees, new security apparatus, et cetera, et cetera. It would have to be gradual. That's why I say that Israeli concessions should be on the settlement side, because that's something that Israel doesn't actually need. I mean, many an expert or military and otherwise in Israel have said that, it's been imperative that the West Bank remain occupied by Israel, because we couldn't have two Hamases at Israel's border, in the sense of the evacuation of Gaza didn't go very well. Obviously people voted in Hamas, even though there was this horrible civil war with Hamas and the PA, and Hamas has been there since 2007, 2008. But, absent, I guess my worry, settlements aside, what I worry about is, when the United States decided to leave Germany and Japan in a big way. Obviously, we still have troops there, but during the Marshall Plan, when we occupied them in a big way, our former adversaries, and built them up. I think we felt we could leave both of those countries, and they would use their own agency and self-government and willingness to improve and change their ways. We would leave, and they would become autonomous, without
existing on the global stage as potential enemies, again, or recurring enemies. I think the worry is always, right? If Israel gives in all those concessions, which I think would require some kind of, I don't know, labor government or something. I don't know. I don't see this government doing it. Or centrist government, is again, I mean, these are the philosophical existential questions that have left me gloomy, but hey, I think human nature sucks. What can I tell you? I mean, you can philosophize all you want, you can strategize all you want, but a remilitarized Palestinian-led West Bank would also be a disaster, and again, it's risk calculation. People who do this for a living know better than I do, but I do worry about that. And number one, but number two, the settlements, where are the settlers going? Would be the second question.
Yeah. So the American occupation of Japan and Germany worked, but it was a 10-year process, which was building towards independence, not building towards permanent American occupation. Correct. And Americans weren't building settlements there, so there was a sense of goodwill. Yes. Israel's lacking that goodwill. These are elements that are important. Again, none of this is a magic bullet. No one wants to be thinking about bullets, obviously, in this context. But none of this is gonna solve the problem. It could, handled correctly, with everything I said, education, support for martyrs, removal of settlement, will drain a lot of the well of ill will and hatred that can be over 10 years, just like the American occupation was in Japan and Germany. There's always a risk, but at the end of the day, this platform of not allowing the Palestinians to have a state, or it's also their fault of not having a Palestinian state, let's be more neutral, has led to first intifada. Second intifada was worse. And now this, in my opinion, is the third intifada, which is the worst of them all. The next one, according to historical pattern, will be worse. So for me, that's a much bigger risk than trying to ameliorate the hostility between the two sides. We need to do everything we can to try. Right now, it seems Israel is committed to not trying. And that is a mistake. The world sees it. The world sees that too. I'm not a believer in doing this for PR reasons, by the way. I'm a believer in doing this in order to promote peace. It's also good for PR, but in order to do peace. As for the settlers will go into Israel proper. Or if the Palestinians are willing to let them stay, some of them stay, that's fine too. The idea is for Israel to acknowledge this is Palestinian territory, and you get to decide who stays and who doesn't stay. We're talking about 400,000 people. They can be relocated, and believe me, the United States and the international community will be happy to foot the bill. And it's moving very, very little. Most of the people there would have to move a few miles, and that's it. And I don't underestimate the problem of leaving your home, but the truth is, everyone who moved to the settlements from 1967 knew that they were moving to a place that was politically problematic. Mm-hmm. They knew what they were getting into. Early on, they also knew that there was a good chance they were going to be evacuated. At this point, they probably don't think that anymore. But for a long time, they knew there was a good chance that was going to happen. And, they enjoyed cheap housing and infrastructure for a reason. It's politically risky and problematic. And I don't think that their well-being, short-term well-being, is worth not having peace.
No, I understand. To the domestic situation in America, which I think is it's always been fraught. It's becoming very worrisome to me. This podcast was created. I'm a proud, independent, pragmatic, hybrid. I don't want to be a member of either political party. I was raised in the Democratic Party. I think they're the competent party that I certainly believes in democracy, but full of really bad ideas. The Republicans have become, Trump worshiping cultists. There's no real viable Tory center-right party in the United States, which it deserves if we're going to be a two-party country. But not unlike the way the Republican Party turned dark and toward the Tea Party and toward MAGA, it's not exactly the same thing. There's an asymmetry in the two parties for sure. Deeply worried that the future of the Democratic Party is a much more dangerous version of what you're describing, incredibly hostile to Israel, give give the Palestinians what they want, basically not committed to the Zionist project, not committed to Israel's security, would love to see a demilitarization of Israel. And then this is the far left. But I mean, I just worry that there is just a generation coming up farther and farther away from the Holocaust and not committed to the American-Israeli relationship, not committed to Jewish identity, not committed to being righteous Gentiles, who see Jews as white oppressors per a lot of the brainwashing that's gone on. I've written about extensively the dangers of DEI and all that stuff because it's really bad for Jews. I think it's bad for everybody, actually, but it's really bad for Jews. And of course, you know, Trump in the immediate future, though I despise him, does seem like a firmer hand for Israel, you know, from an American perspective. He's crazy. He doesn't believe in anything. I hate to even say that. But I definitely am concerned that a post-Joe Biden Democratic Party is very problematic. By the way, we're very never Trump here. And this has nothing to do with an endorsement of Trump. My whole identity is never Trump. But the American situation and what's happened to the left is not, it's a big deal, college campuses and where they've gone. It's not small because the left has institutional power the right doesn't have. They have media, they've got universities, they've got, you know, the right doesn't have that institutional power. So, you know, what does this mean, you know, for the American-Israeli relationship, in your opinion?
Yeah, so I think the problem that Jews and Israelis are facing with American politics today is much, much bigger than Israel and Judaism, or the attitudes towards them. And that's why there's so very little that we can do about it, which makes it all the more frightening.
Sure.
So when we talk about a special U.S.-Israeli relationship, what we're talking about is a relationship based on values. It's a relationship based on values like democracy. And what we're seeing in the United States is the evaporation of those values on both sides. We're seeing on both sides. We're seeing a lack of belief in the American project and the values that it represents. And it comes in different colors. You have Trump saying, you know, I'll encourage Russia to attack NATO, or I love, you know, Xi Jinping and North Korea. They're great. That's one form of it. The other is, you know, Yemen, make us proud, turn another ship around. It's all worship of America's enemies. It's disgust with American exceptionalism, American democracy, American institutions, capitalism, all the things that unite the U.S. and Israel, and that Jews in America have sheltered under and had a relatively prosperous existence without as much persecution as they've had elsewhere.
Yep.
So everything that creates those ties, that creates the security for Jews, is dying. And that's happening much more quickly on the right. We know that because Trump is their candidate. But it's happening on the left too. The Democratic Party has had a lot of success in fighting it off in primaries and things like that. Biden is still the candidate. Kamala Harris, anyone you think of who is set to take over from Biden, whether it's Harris or Buttigieg or Newsom or anyone like that, is still on the liberal side, is still on the side that believes in American values, but it's threatened. So right now, the way I see the map, there's a little sliver of actual belief in American values on the moderate Democratic side, and they still run the party. So it's very important, I think, for anyone who values democracy, Judaism, relations with Israel, any of that, to rally behind the moderate Democrats while they still have power there and fend off what's happening from the extreme left. If you're a Republican and you're a Jew and Israel matters to you, or Israel matters to you without being a Jew, or democracy matters to you, then you would vote for Nikki Haley, who I'm not a huge fan of for certain reasons, but in terms of her foreign policy, commitment to democracy, NATO, Israel, she has great credentials, or at least she says the right things. So that's how I see it. This is so much more alarming than just anti-Semitism. I'm a Jew, so I'm worried about anti-Semitism probably more than anything else, but it's so much more alarming than that. I look at America.
Well, I am too. I mean, anti-Semitism is, I've not seen it. I haven't seen it uncorked quite in this way. But remember, you know, neo-Nazis marching on a causeway or a highway in Florida and everyone getting mad around DeSantis, those are thuggoon morons. I'm much more worried about institutionally protected ideological Turks who are growing up in an environment who will be the future in many industries, harboring a deep anti-Semitic belief, a conflation of Judaism and whiteness. In my opinion, a lot of kind of vengeful Marxism. I mean, there's a lot in there that and I mean that theoretically, that worries me. You know,
no, I agree with you.
That doesn't mean I see neo-Nazis marching. I'm like, yay, like good guy. I just think that they have zero institutional power. And they,
I think that our president in the past and possible next president is someone who does their bidding in many ways and is allied with that whole movement and that whole worldview. I see it differently from this side is bad, or is this side bad, that side bad, which side is worse? I see darkness closing in on us from both sides.
No, I agree with you. And then I'm no defender of Trump. Trump is unique in that way. I do think that part of this sort of Christian thrust of the Republican Party, the obviously white nationalist biblical thrust, you know, Israel's just more in their kishkas, you know, it may be for the wrong reasons, but okay. I mean, you know, so what, you know, I mean, so what, you know, that's
no, I've always been a big fan. I'm the liberal and et cetera. I've always gotten into trouble for saying evangelicals want to support us. Great.
Hey, I'll say it on here because I'm a committed agnostic, borderline atheist. Jesus ain't coming back to Megiddo, but I'm happy to have your support. It's just, that's how I feel.
Exactly. You know? I agree with you 100%. But
I'm glad you believe it's the Holy Land. It is the Holy Land. Let's keep going. You're right.
If you think that Israel's going to be the war of Armageddon, that's fine because it's not happening. So
not happening, so that's fine. Right. Okay.
Agree. 100%. Here's the issue, though. Those people are like the moderate Democrats. They represent the past to some extent.
Yes.
There's an extreme right. You know, when we're talking about, you know, you got people like Jake Shields and all sorts of anti-Semites who say the exact same thing that the extreme left says. There's no real difference. The whole horseshoe theory.
The horseshoe theory, the Venn diagram. Right.
It's real. What they share is a hatred for institutions and democracy, and they see Jews as representing institutions of democracy. Yes. They say it's Zionist, occupied America, and those institutions represent Israel, and they both sides say that now. They've united their talking points. The differences aren't great. What we need to rally behind are the institutions and democracy to save us from that. That's what really matters. Deciding which side is worse, which side is better is a good sport for Twitter. It's not going to help us at all. We need to buttress the institutions against these threats.
If Trump wins again, God forbid, right? He may. What does that mean for America, Israel, Netanyahu? How does that all play out?
I don't believe that it will be good for Israel in any way, because the way I view Israel is its security is sheltered in the Western democratic countries, the countries that supply us with arms, the countries that vote for us in the UN, the countries that offer support. At the end of the day, are the Western democracies. Pro-Israelis love to pick on countries like Canada or Australia or the UK and the United States for not supporting enough, but they're the only ones that do. And once the NATO is gone, and once American hegemony is gone, then the world is a very dark place for everyone, but especially for Jews and for Israel. So the well-being of NATO, the well-being of American hegemony, the well-being of America's allies is of paramount concern to Israeli and American security. So I think the damage that Trump will do to American standing in the world, to its alliances, to democracy by abandoning Ukraine will far outdo any symbolic recognition he'll have of settlements or whatever weird stuff he's going to do. None of that really matters. People bring up the embassy. That changed nothing. That matters in no way at all. And Netanyahu won't even be there most likely by the time Trump is there. And if he is, he's also a threat to democracy, also a threat to the link between the U.S. and Israel. And I think what really matters is to defend democracy and its institutions globally, because that's when Israel is at its safest. I don't see any distinction between the two.
Yeah. Are the UAE, Abraham Accords, excuse me, with the United Arab Emirates, wouldn't you say that that was a triumph that went under celebrated because Trump was involved?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Trump had two big triumphs in the Middle East. Like I said, I don't care about the embassy, but I do care about killing Soleimani. That was wonderful. I tweeted many thanks to Trump at the time, and I will thank him for that today. Great move. The Democrats might not have made it. As for the Abraham Accords, those were good. I do think that trying to bypass the Palestinians has bitten us in the ass with October 7th. In retrospect, that may not have been the best strategic move, but it was a coup of diplomacy. The UAE relationship does look like it's going to survive. I don't know about some of the other ones. Yeah. He deserved more credit for it than he got. I think it was part of the wrong strategy. I would put that maybe more in Netanyahu's door than Trump's.
Yeah.
For those two things, he deserves a lot of credit. And if he's president again, he will do things that will make Israel very happy. I just think that in the long term, he will undermine its security and its well-being and its relationship with the United States.
Right. I mean, it's, when you look at all the countries now that Israel has peace with, okay, for a long time, certainly when I was growing up, the theory was Israel would have no peace, it went, with any of its Arab neighbors until it made peace with Palestinians. And actually is proving out not to be true. It's proving out to be true that the lack of a Palestinian state threatens Israel's security, but Israel continues to, and if there's any kind of real normalization with the Saudis, as we started talking about, Israel will have made quite a few arrangements for its long-term security, absent a peace with the Palestinians, which is very interesting because that didn't used to be the thinking. The thinking went the entire Arab world would really never negotiate. Of course, Egypt came along and then Jordan, but the rest of it would never follow suit until Israel dealt with the Palestinian problem. How come the Arab world takes no responsibility for the Palestinian problem?
Oh, okay. So those are two different elements. Okay, yeah. I'll start with the with peace. Yes, Israel has shown that it can make peace with the Arab states without the Palestinians. However, those peace relationships tend to be very skin deep, and people tend to be against them. And I support these agreements, but they do seem to have some provocative element of creating increased hopelessness among the Palestinians, which may lead to official peace with some states, but it certainly doesn't help Israelis live in peace.
Right.
What some people have pointed out is these peace agreements are with countries that Israel isn't. Egypt is a big exception, but the others are countries that Israel wasn't really at war with. They just, had decent relations with them, and now they became normalized.
Well, Jordan, we were at war with.
Not at that time. Jordan had removed itself from the circle of belligerency in '73 and was clearly not returning.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, they actually warned Israel about that war. For example.
Yes.
As for why don't they take responsibility? Well, we know that the Palestinian political movements have always been historically terrorist organizations.
Yes.
And when you let these terrorist organizations into your country, or you even let too many of these people into your country with their support of terrorism, you pay terrible consequences for it. Right. The three most clear examples are Jordan, which was almost overthrown in 1970 by the PLO.
They expelled the Palestinians pretty much, didn't they?
They expelled the PLO. And its supporters, Fatah. Then there was what happened in Lebanon, where the PLO didn't cause the civil war, but in
82. Yeah.
Well, in 75, there was a civil war in Lebanon.
Oh, right.
Nothing to do with Israel, that the PLO was part of. Israel joined in 82 in the middle. It's a good story for people to know what actually happened there. It's much more complicated. People only care when Israel's involved. Yeah, that war did not start because of Israel. It didn't start because of the PLO. But the PLO made everything much worse, and they dragged Israel in. And some people blame them for a good portion of the destruction that Lebanon experienced there, I think correctly. Then there was the Palestinians in Kuwait. In 1991, when Kuwait was invaded by Saddam Hussein, the Palestinians supported him, the country that had taken them in and was paying their wages. They betrayed it. and supported Saddam Hussein taking them over. So
Right.
the Arab states see the Palestinians as disloyal, terror-supporting people, and that's why they don't want them in. That's why Egypt is so alarmed about Israel going to Rafah. Not because they're that worried about the humanitarian situation, maybe a little bit. They don't want Palestinians to come into Egypt. They're worried they'll end up supporting terrorism there and undermining the Egyptian regime. That's why they don't do anything for the Palestinians. They don't trust them.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, very understandable, and that's good history to know. So, Shaiel, because I want to conclude, I want you to talk just in general, because I always like to ask people, you know, how do they best reflect themselves? What are things people don't know about you? You know, I like to ask these guests, my guests, these questions. You were at IDF Intelligence. That's where I'm going with this, right? And give everybody I don't know, the gestalt of that. You know, what was that like? I mean, what a fascinating time in your life that must have been. What does that entail? What's it like being part of that that world?
Well, it's very unglamorous because you're not an officer. You're the most junior analyst that there can be, and you're inundated with information 24/7 that can be incredibly inconclusive, and you don't always have the context to it. You also have to pick up language skills on the fly. Any small mistake, people are up your ass. It's a lot of pressure and incredibly stressful. But you do feel like you're making an incredible contribution to the country and to its security by doing so. And when we have all these intelligence failures that people always talk about, spare a thought for the people who are analyzing all this information. You're getting a lot of contradictory information, and you know that the people above you see things a certain way, and that if anything contradicts the way they see things, which you don't always agree with, they're not going to accept your report. So it's an incredibly difficult job to figure out what's really going on. And, you know, with hindsight, we can always see where things were going, but the real-time information is never clear. So it's very stressful. And, you know, when you're a kid and you don't have the analytical capacities you later develop, you can make all sorts of mistakes too. Right.
And also, before we go, very interesting. Before we go, talk a little bit just quickly about the Israeli settlement book. Speaking.
Yeah. So I have a book coming out later this year. Okay. It's about U.S. policy towards Israeli settlements. The story I cover is how in 1967, Israel started building settlements, how the U.S. opposed that, how the U.S. tried to stop it, what it did to try to stop it, why that failed. And in the 1980s, I show how the United States decided to accept the settlements and allow them to stay. So I have an arc of how that
Reagan said
this was under Reagan. This was under Reagan, and it was in exchange for Israel supporting the U.S. against its local enemies, which was Iran. And we still see the same thing today. The United States allows Israel to do things that it doesn't agree with in exchange for its continued geopolitical support in its bid to either dominate the Middle East or balance its enemies in the Middle East. So what I claim in my book is that there's no real American policy towards the occupation or the settlements, but rather that policy is determined by the wider geopolitical considerations of the United States, and how the United States has basically said, you can continue to do whatever you want with the settlements, and we'll only nominally oppose it. Basically, everything that the Americans say about settlements to this day is mostly manufactured for PR reasons.
Right. Well, Shaiel Ben-Ephraim, I have really enjoyed our conversation. I feel very enlightened as always. As yet again, Israel, the country you and I both love, America, country, but we both adore, obviously, are both at an inflection point. We have overlapping values and interests. To your point, the American project and its unique experiment over nearly 250 years, and Israel at 75 have a lot to be proud of, and there's a lot at stake both of them. And so I'd like to bring you back again to talk more about, again, when your book comes out, but more about what happens in Rafah, where we head with this, where we go, where we're headed, and how much democracy matters, no matter where you live or how you live, and how often too many take it for granted. You know?
I would be delighted to come on and discuss all those things. We share a deep commitment to democracy and the United States and Israel. It's been a pleasure. We do.
It's a pleasure. This has been my talk with Shaiel Ben-Ephraim. By the way, make sure you listen to History of the Land of Israel podcast. It's great. His YouTube channel is Israel Explained. It's also great. Shaiel, before you go, tell everybody where to follow you on Twitter, because there is a treasure trove there.
Yes, follow me on Twitter at academic_LA, where I report on the conflict, some would say borderline obsessively, and give the liberal variant of what's happening in Israel, what's happening in the United States, and the connection between the two. Indeed, he does, and we are all the better for it. Shaiel Ben, thank you again, folks. As always, stay dirty, stay moderate, and stay safe.